Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining today's webinar on academic public partnerships for policy. I'm Chris Field, director of the Stanford Woods Institute for the Environment. Today's webinar is co-hosted by the Woods Institute and the National Caucus of Environmental Legislators. Before addressing the main topic, I want to start with acknowledging the indigenous people on whose ancestral land those of us at Stanford sit today. Stanford sits on the ancestral land of the Muwekma Ohlone tribe. This land was and continues to be of great importance to the Ohlone people. Consistent with our values of community and inclusion, we have a responsibility to acknowledge, honor, and make visible the university's relationship with the Native peoples. The Stanford Woods Institute for the Environment is a founding pillar in the Stanford Doerr School of Sustainability. The Institute is a cross-campus hub for advancing understanding and developing practical, fair solutions to our era's pressing environmental problems. After today, our next event is a webinar tomorrow at 11 o'clock on reallocating the residential California climate credit to low-income customers. See the Woods website for more information. Created by and for state legislatures, the National Caucus of Environmental Legislators serves as a resource on environmental issues through legislative research, organized events, and by facilitating collaboration between lawmakers working on similar issues. The next 4 years of environmental and climate policy development are likely to be concentrated at the state level. State-by-state policy opens opportunities for locally tailored solutions to each state's most pressing environmental challenges. As state policymakers strategize and prioritize what they want to tackle, how can researchers serve as effective partners to support decision-making with sound science to achieve practical, equitable outcomes? Today, we'll explore strategies that have worked and partnerships that can be built. We'll hear from practitioners about ways scholars can contribute to the conversation, key factors to consider when engaging with the policy process, and issue areas to watch. For today's webinar, I'm thrilled to be joined by Suzanne Case, Luke Harkins, Jason John, and Dylan McDowell. Suzanne Case is the inaugural director of the University of Hawaii Office of Land and Ocean Conservation Futures, established in 2023. She previously served under Governor David E. Gay as director of the State of Hawaii Department of Land and Natural Resources, where she oversaw the work of 11 divisions. Prior to her service at DLNR, Suzanne worked at the Nature Conservancy for 28 years, including as executive director of the Hawaii program. Luke Harkins is the chief of staff for Oregon State Representative David Gomberg. Luke's also served as the Coastal Caucus coordinator. David Gomberg is in his sixth term representing House District 10 along Oregon's coast. Representative Gomberg serves as co-vice chair of the Full Ways and Means Budgeting Committee and is co-chair of the Subcommittee on Transportation and Economic Development. He's a member of the Ocean Science Trust. His most recent legislative efforts have focused on infrastructure investments, wildfire recovery, and emergency response. Jason John is the deputy director of the California Council on Science and Technology, where he oversees the expansion and coordination of CCST's science services, communications and outreach, and the CCST Science and Technology Policy Fellowship Program. Jason previously served as acting director of Sierra Club California and was a science and policy lead for the California Natural Resource Agency's Biodiversity and Habitat team, where he helped develop the state's Pathways to 30 by 30 strategy. Jason has a PhD in physiological ecology, the same as me, from the University of California in Santa Cruz. Dylan McDowell is the executive director of the National Caucus of Environmental Legislators. Originally trained as a science communicator, Dylan has developed education and communication materials for the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center, the Hatfield Marine Science Center, and Oregon Sea Grant. At Oregon State University, Dylan expanded OSU extension programs in the state legislature and managed legislator outreach. Based in Salem, Oregon, Dylan is chair of the city's Parks and Recreation Advisory Board, and my personal favorite, he's co-founder of Salem Bike Vision, an initiative to increase safe and protected infrastructure throughout the community. The format for today's conversation is that I'll kick things off with a few questions. At about 20 minutes before the hour, I'll turn the figurative microphone to all of you in the audience and pose questions that you have entered. To get a question into the queue, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And apologies in advance if we don't have time to get to all the questions. Let me start with a question for Luke. Can you give us a flavor for the way a concept about an environmental issue becomes a bill in Oregon? And in particular, how do you think about integrating constituent and scientific priorities on important environmental issues?
Yeah, absolutely. So, as you had mentioned, I'm Chief of Staff to the chair of the Oregon Legislative Coastal Caucus. We operate a bit differently than I think most caucuses in legislatures, in that we are a bipartisan, bicameral, and consensus-driven caucus. So that means we got Republicans, we've got Democrats, and we've got House and Senate members. And we operate on this consensus-driven process to ensure that A, we're all pulling in the same direction, and B, we all feel comfortable. We're not walking over each other's caucus agenda priorities. And we also try to do that from an informed place, and that's where the Oregon Sea Grant Fellowship has been very helpful. When it comes to the constituent and academic and scientific engagement, every term we try to bring on a legislative fellow from Oregon Sea Grant, typically someone with a marine science background, to help us guide our policy decision making in a nonpartisan, geographic way. We are all members of legislative districts that represent each of the coastal regions of Oregon, and so we kind of look at things less of a partisan angle, but more of a geographic angle. And Sea Grant really helps us cut through that partisan chatter and put someone in place who can answer the questions, who can kind of turn temperatures down on discussions where, let's face it, we're all lay people here in the legislature, and help us kind of guide a policy that's driven not by, headlines, but by informed discussion. So yeah, that's a bit how we operate. And I think we've been doing pretty well. One of the longest running caucuses in the legislature here. And yeah, and the Sea Grant program.
That's very helpful. Thanks.
Yeah. Mhm.
Suzanne, you've worked both sides of the university state government conversation. I wonder if you could share a few thoughts about ways that university voices can be most effective in supporting state legislative action.
Sure. I think what we all want to do is make sure that, as Luke says, if we are lay people, we want to get the most information as possible. We're all kind of generalists, and we want to be able to guide policy with as much information as possible. And so that's the connection that we are working on in strengthening the relationships really between legislators and staffers, and university experts in various fields. The University of Hawaii is a land, sea, sky, and sun university, R1 university, with experts in all kinds of environmental related fields: natural resource management, renewable energy, invasive species, water, fire, and so we want people to be able to know who to call, or at least know who to call, to ask who to call, to get information that guides policy. And I think one really important thing to do is to build those relationships, personal relationships, so that people are comfortable just picking up the phone or sending me an email that says, what do you know about this that can do a deep dive. Respectful relationships with different points of view, very, very important. And also, one thing that we found very helpful is site visits. And we do that a lot with like the water and land committees, the environmental committees, the finance, ways and means committees, to actually go to places to see what the issues are and what the solutions are, and to, in the process, again, become comfortable with the people who they can call on.
I think this theme of the importance of personal relationships is something we'll probably come back to again and again during the hour. And Jason, I think of the California Council on Science and Technology as kind of a Swiss Army knife for advice on important issues. And I wonder if you can say whether the main mode of operation is that people in the government come to you for advice, or you assemble products that you think are going to be useful in a predictive manner?
No, thank you so much, Chris. And that is kind of our role, being that Swiss Army knife of being here to serve and to help out and support in any way we can. Sometimes that is through being responsive to requests from the state legislature, from our executive agencies, whether it's a topic specific or in response to something that's happening kind of in the immediate term. Those are things that we can do as far as expert briefings. We can do peer-reviewed reports that are very rigorously kind of reviewed and gone through a peer review process so that it is bringing together the best information that we can bring to bear on these important issues. On the other hand, there are a lot of things that we see kind of on the horizon. And so representing the partner organizations that we work with, the incredible research community that we have here in California, from the universities, our federal labs, our private institutions, state scientists who come to a lot of these convenings, having that opportunity, having those relationships, as you and as Suzanne pointed out, is really what allows us to kind of get a view for what might be coming up down the road in 1 or 5 or 10 years. And so it really does kind of depend on having that network of expertise, having people who can highlight some of the things that they see coming and allow us to elevate some of those ideas, those thoughts, those concerns, so we can bring it all together between the research, the community needs, and the policy needs, and have those conversations.
We'll definitely come back to some of the particulars of the issues that you think are on this sort of 1, 2, 5-year horizon. But before we do that, let me turn to Dylan and ask, when you look across the whole landscape of state legislators taking action on environmental issues, what do you see as the things where we're most likely to see progress? And what are some of the main lessons that states can be learning from each other as they start down the path of implementation?
Yeah, really great question. And I think while I start, I'll just kind of paint a little picture of how different state legislatures are, because I think sometimes California, for example, is very well staffed up as a legislature, which is great. And that has allowed them to do a lot of things, especially in the science realm. But many states have very little or no staff as for legislators. You have states like Nevada where they meet every other year. You have states like New Hampshire where they get paid $100 per year to serve in office. And so you have limited time, limited staffing, you have limited session length. So this capacity challenge, I think, is very real. And it's something where this conversation is so important, because each of these programs we're hearing about really augments the resources available to legislators to help them really think about how science comes in, even if their legislature is set up in maybe more of a part-time basis or set up in that sense for staffing. In terms of the issues, so NCEL, we serve as a resource and a hub for lawmakers across the country. And we like to say we're remote environmental staff for exactly what you're saying, Chris, of how do you take a lesson from one state to another? And that might be looking at things like a fellowship program and saying, how can you set this up? What worked really well? Or setting up an environmental caucus. We're seeing a lot of these kind of structural conversations going on right now where states want to embed better decision-making processes and opportunities into their state legislature. I think in terms of issues, there's a lot that we could go down, a lot of areas to talk about. I would just say, the Coastal Caucus is a good example where there's a lot of conversations around coastal resource management, blue carbon, and thinking about the blue economy in general. And I think that's an example where they're, both University of Hawaii, I imagine CCST, and I know in the Coastal Caucus in Oregon, that's where some of the research can really help inform those discussions and think about what are some of these best practices, what more research needs to happen. And that really helps legislatures think about where funding can be best directed, whether it's additional studies or making sure these fellowships are in place for the long term and are able to persist as new questions arise, whether it's about wildlife and habitat, chemicals, things like that.
I'd like to stick with this theme of the value of fellowships for scientists who are assisting state legislatures. Come up in almost all of the comments so far. Luke, you mentioned the value of the fellows. I wonder if you can say a little more about what they do and how you take advantage of them, and what you ideally look for in fellows.
Yeah, absolutely. So the as Dylan rightly mentioned, Oregon is a smaller state where we do not have the capacity to bring on, the robust staff that some other larger states or DC has for their decision-making discussions. And especially so when we do choose staff, it's going to be people like me who are political science majors or urban and public affairs majors, folks who do not have the robust understanding of a lot of these issues that are just so critical and important. And so being able to place fellowships in our office really helps us build capacity and gets us connected with a more diverse array of majors and interests that can help us navigate the more complex issues. I like to say, we have expertise in legislative process, but we need the people who can really bridge the gap between the science and the policy decision making. So that's really the fellows' important job there, is to really help inform all of us. Mhm.
And what's the pathway by which fellows come into association
Yeah.
with?
Yeah, so typically we've been working with Oregon Sea Grant for a number of years. I don't even know how many, long before I've been with this office. And they put out their RFAs. They solicit the folks that are typically in marine sciences. But of course we actually our current fellow that we're bringing on is actually an environmental law student, so a little different this time, but has some marine background. And then we start working with our vice chair, typically from the other party, to help select from the finalists. And really, we're looking for people who understand a more holistic view of the Oregon coast. It's not just about conservation issues here, but also, how do we support our commercial fisheries? How do we support our research hubs at NOAA, at the Hatfield Marine Science Center out of Oregon State University? And how do we tackle big projects like offshore wind proposals? We're looking for someone who has that holistic understanding of the coastal issues that we're tackling here in Oregon. Mhm.
Jason, you run the fellows program for CCST. I wonder if you could speak to what you hope fellows deliver and what you hope fellows learn.
Absolutely. And yeah, we have an incredible team of people here who are really kind of running and managing that program as well. And personally, I can speak to it as someone who went through our fellowship program. When I finished my PhD, I was a fellow with CCST, and that was where I originally started off with the Natural Resources Agency. And I think one of the things that's really special is we all kind of come into this space with that desire to help, to make a difference. I think regardless of whether or not we're political science, we have that, the expertise that Luke and that the colleagues here in the legislature and the executive branch have on the political side, or we're coming from an environmental science or a different background like that. I think we all have that desire to serve and to make a difference. And so one of the great things about these fellowship programs is it both provides fellows with that opportunity to come in to learn from people who have so much institutional knowledge and expertise, to find out those ways of being able to apply some of the experience that they had, while also learning and growing and finding new ways to move into this space and help out. And so for us, we actually have our fellowship program is open for this next year. The applications are open, but there's also there's programs across the country that are springing up, and there are more and more coming each year. And so it's a great opportunity for people to learn how to help out on the ground, at home, or in different states where they see these opportunities to make a difference.
Dylan, can you comment on how many fellowship programs there are, how many states have their own programs, and how people can figure out if they can apply?
I don't have a specific list myself. I know that there is one out there, and I can look that up in a second here. But I was just sharing before the call started that it's pretty wide ranging, and I know some other states are looking at creating it. Missouri has one, for example, which I think really gets at the widespread nature of this, that it's not just, concentrated on the West Coast or in large states, but really spread across the country in different types of science fellowship programs. And I think one other piece I would add is anecdotally, we've seen a lot more career diversity in legislatures in the a couple last elections. So we're seeing folks coming in with maybe more of a science background or freshwater sciences. We're seeing folks come in with epidemiologist backgrounds, people that are maybe engineers. And it's been very interesting because historically, a lot of folks come from careers that allow them to take 6 months, maybe more, off for a legislature. And there's limited jobs that allow you to do that. So you end up with a lot of lawyers, consultants, retirees. That's kind of historical trend, and that's been changing. And so what's exciting is we're seeing more science coming in from the decision maker side, but that still ends up being concentrated in a couple offices. And so the fellowship model, like what we're hearing about from these different options, I think is really exciting because it makes sure you're not just putting everything on one person, but we're just seeing this larger trend, I think, of how can we get science in legislatures across the country.
Can you say just a couple more things about how professional or part-time legislatures are around the country?
It really is about 40 out of the 50 are pretty much fully part-time, if not more. And there's only a few that go throughout the year. And those tend to be the bigger states like California, New York, Michigan, and even those have gaps built in. And so there's the size varies widely. Just to give a few examples, Nebraska is the only unicameral legislature. There's actually only one chamber in Nebraska versus a House and a Senate. You have states like New Hampshire, where there's over 400 representatives in the House, and then I believe it's 23 or 24 senators in the Senate. And so a very interesting, juxtaposition between the two chambers. States like Montana, Nevada, and Texas, they only meet every other year. Oregon, which I should disclose, I grew up in Representative Gomberg's district, so big close to home hearing Luke talk here. Oregon used to be one of those every other year states, and they've added what's called the short session and even years. It's a 35-day session, usually for the month of February, plus a little of March. And so you have really limited timelines. Some states like Virginia, it's 60-day sessions, sometimes even shorter. And so that everything is very fast paced, decisions, committees, it all happens very quickly. So a lot of the work, and that's where a lot of these science committees or kind of study committees can come out of legislatures to say, maybe we don't have the information for this right now, but we're going to create a study committee or an initiative that can look at this over the interim. And that's where some of these scientific partnerships, whether it's with universities like University of Hawaii, through fellowships, through other means, can really help inform that decision making and lead into those short sessions or upcoming opportunities.
Suzanne, I wonder if you can say a little bit more about the two areas where you have a lot of expertise. One is the university support for the legislatures, and also how NGOs like the Nature Conservancy or the Sierra Club that Jason has worked with can feed information and ideas and support into state legislators.
Yes, and I along that line, I want to add to the fellows discussion. Even if you don't have a formal fellows program, your staffers can develop expertise in what you are doing is building the next generation of leaders, and some of them will go on to be staffers and legislators, and they are a key part of really building these relationships with universities and NGOs as well. So it's really important for NGOs and university people, when there is an issue up, to provide the information, take the initiative to provide information to the legislators. If there's an issue before the session, you can go in and talk and say, hey, this is a real problem. I think we might need a bill here to improve the situation. What do you think? And how can we help you with information, or sometimes even drafting language that they can consider for a bill. Informational briefings that the legislators hold, if it's intended to really build public awareness of a conservation environmental issue, that's a great model. Often right before session or in between sessions, to bring in experts and ask them to just present on what they know about an issue and possible solutions. That's a great venue as well, in addition to just simply testifying on bills to make sure that the expertise you have and the solutions you have to offer are considered by all the members of the committees, and ultimately in a final vote.
And Suzanne, can you comment a little on especially how university people can walk the tightrope between providing information and drifting into lobbying? I know many university people are concerned that they don't want to be lobbying, and legally restricted from doing
I mean,
that.
if you're providing, I mean, certainly if you're providing information in response to a request, so that's where the legislative the legislators and the staff can initiate that, and then the answer is absolutely yes. We have information that will help you with your decision making, and that's testifying actually on a bill in a hearing is probably the area where people need to be careful if they don't want to be lobbying. Sometimes they do want to be lobbying. And so then, you just make sure you're doing it in your individual capacity and not representing maybe not, depending on the university policies or the researcher policies. But there are lots of ways to provide information that will be really helpful for informed policy without it being a lobbying issue.
Jason, you've worked on both sides of the NGO and government boundary. I wonder if you have other thoughts on how NGOs can be most helpful to legislators in ways that that makes the process move forward and doesn't tangle it up in NGO politics.
It's a great question. I think especially CCST, one of our core tenets is that we are nonpartisan and a nonpartisan nonprofit. We are independent, and our entire purpose is to provide scientific information and data and analyses that are as free from biases as are humanly possible. That is, it goes through a conflict of interest policy, it goes through a peer review process, and that entire process is very intentional about making sure that the information that we are providing, whether it is our findings, conclusions, or recommendations in a larger peer-reviewed report, or if it's an expert briefing, that it is something that is geared towards providing the best available information without trying to push for a specific direction or a specific policy, and kind of understanding that as much information as we can provide, there is always that greater context that it also lives within in the policy sphere. And so I think kind of having those conversations, having that understanding of there is often so much additional context that staffers, that state scientists, that are different legislators, that they actually also hold, and being able to provide all the information, making it very accessible, bringing it forward in a way that is easy to find. I think that's a great way to be able to both support the process to get that information out there, and also to provide kind of those resources in the way that can move things forward.
Luke, maybe you could comment a little bit on the things you've seen that make it effective for scientists to communicate in ways that don't seem too complicated, too technical, or too on the one hand, on the other hand.
Yeah, no, I think in our office we've had a lot of discussions about science communication with legislative fellows. We see this as an area where I think these fellowship programs are really kind of pushing the needle on this. It's one thing to look at these scientific papers and talk to and hear from presentations from academic institutions. It's another thing to wrap our heads around those as lay people. And these fellows, part of what I've been kind of hoping that the fellowship program can provide, not only for us, but for these academic institutions, is building almost a next generation of science communicators who understand legislative process. They understand the complications and the relationships in our state legislative buildings, and can step into the political arena here. And of course, understanding the line between lobbying and providing that information, but being able to be more effective at communicating. We did a lot of work on our Marine Reserves program in 2022 and in 2023, and actually in 2024. It's been an ongoing issue, which is you'll find a lot. Our last legislative fellow, I really wanted to put her on that bill, that legislative action, to try to understand the legislative process. And throughout all of that, it was really, this legislation was all about taking the Ocean Policy Advisory Council here in Oregon, taking their 10-year assessment and status report, and trying to implement a lot of the things that this program needed to be more equitable with engagement, to be more equitable with our tribal nations, with our fisheries, and along the way, our fellow was able to get us connected to a lot of academic partners who could help us kind of sift through a lot of these recommendations and figure out what's important, what can we, what are we able to compromise on to ensure that this passes in a bipartisan fashion, and understand, just how important the work is and being able to communicate that to other legislative offices who might be asking, well, hey, I live in Portland. Why are marine reserves so important to me? Why should I care? And the fellow was, Megan was instrumental in getting that bill across the finish line. Hmm.
Dylan, I know that effective science communication is one of your priorities. Is that something that you focus on broadly in NCEL?
Absolutely. And I think we really try and be a hub in terms of amplifying work. And so it's not just about connecting lawmakers with their peers in other states, but also with resources, experts, studies that can really help support the work they're doing. And oftentimes, we like to say the resources we develop, we want them to be digestible on the way to a committee hearing. So a lot of one-page fact sheets, for example, and it's, here's 1 or 2 paragraphs on an issue, here's some examples of policies from other states, and here are some links for more information. And on our website, we try and build out more of those links as well and make sure that we can give people those deeper dives. And oftentimes that's through, academic institutions or nonprofits and other groups that have done really deep studies and expertise on that. And I think in general, one thing we try and do is help for lawmakers to think about how these issues are connected. And I think when things come through a legislative desk, and Luke, you can talk about this too, it's very rarely just a single issue in terms of sometimes they're wrapped into what's called omnibus bills, where you have multiple topics. There's budget considerations. If there's a funding request, a fiscal note, then you have to think about where that comes out of the budget. There's these different competing factors that have to go into it. Sometimes it's purely the timeline of when things are going to be brought up, where it is in session. And so helping lawmakers think about, marine reserves can be actually beneficial for water quality and fisheries. And these are impacting things in other areas. And it's not just about this is really good for conservation, but trying to think about how topics have multiple impacts, I think is really important because it allows different entry points. And scientists and good communicators are able to help draw those linkages out, I think. And so that's something we try and do and really rely on some of these really effective science communicators to make those connections, which will then inform better policy and hopefully see stronger state solutions.
That's a perfect setup for the next round of questions I wanted to ask, which concern, especially in an era where the administration in Washington hasn't indicated any kind of priority on environmental issues, what you guys see as the areas that are most ripe for action and where action is going to be most important. But before I do that, I want to remind people that we're going to switch in about 5 minutes over to questions from the audience. And if you would like to get a question in the queue, enter it in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. Suzanne, you want to start us off with the issues that you see as most ripe for action and maybe most needing action in the context of a federal government that's not prioritizing environment?
Yeah, and there's no question that the role of the states, the role of local governments is going, and nonprofits and foundations and the philanthropic sector is going to be more important than ever to step up. But I would say, first of all, stay the course. We are all doing really important work, and we don't know what the future is, and so we just have to keep doing everything we can, as fast as possible. Substantively, obviously, there's some important areas to look at hard. I think renewable energy is one. Conservation is always one. We have issues that are staring at us in the face, and we're going to have to deal with them locally. We're going to have to deal with them at every level of government. But wildfire is obviously a really severe one on the coastal states. It's sea level rise and coastal erosion. All of those environmental issues are very, the impact is very local, and it's on real people across the spectrum. And so all of us will need to just drill down on those and, make sure we can do the best we can for everyone.
Maybe I'll pick up the fire thread and pass it over to Jason, where fire policy obviously has been in the news for California in the last few weeks, with the voices from Washington having strong opinions about ways that California should manage its fire risks. What do you see as possibilities for state action on fire risk reduction and fire management?
Absolutely. I think it's something that we've realized, and especially here in California, where there's so much acreage that consists of the state, and so much of it is in forests or is in kind of the wildland urban interface near homes. It's all variable. It's all these different habitats, all these different environments are different, and so they do need different types of fire management. And so I think what we've seen over the past number of years, even not just this year, is that so much of this work, it's coordinated at the state level, and it's centered in the knowledge of the communities and the people who are living in the areas that are around those habitats. And so I think having state coordination that can connect the dots between the resources, between the communities, between the knowledge bases and all these different universities in our communities, that's such an important piece of how we're going to be able to do this effectively. It can't be a one-size-fits-all approach because it's not a consistent habitat. And so I think really kind of having kind of the coordination level connected with the community and the traditional knowledge and all of those different aspects of it that are going to be critical to really getting ahead or starting to kind of address these issues is so important. And I think that's something that we've also been seeing more and more over the years as we're starting to realize how to address these different issues.
You mentioned a couple of times the importance of good working relationships with tribes and rural communities. Do you have thoughts on how those are going to play out and how we might leverage those for better environmental outcomes in the coming years?
Yeah, I think, first of all, you can't do this job without that kind of stakeholder engagement. As Jason mentioned, we're going to need to rely on our tribal partners, on our local governments to help kind of make a coordinated effort to tackle some of the big issues that are coming our way. We're concerned here in Oregon. We don't know what the next 4 years holds, and I'm not trying to make this a partisan panel here,
Sure.
but we genuinely don't know. And will we have federal partners to rely on? To be determined. So yeah, I think really leaning in on our local relationships, our tribal relationships, I think is going to be absolutely critical. And I don't know if that helps answer your question, but yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Dylan, one of the things we've heard a lot about, especially in the context of the new administration, is requests from some states to transfer federal lands back to state ownership. Is that something you think we're going to see a lot of action on? And how do you see the role of state legislatures in that dynamic?
That's a great question. And there's been a lot of those conversations for about a decade now, if not longer. And I think the question is, what would that land then be used for? And I think while there's conversations, and this is where science plays a really big role, is thinking about there's a lot of conversations of the land being taken back to states. So then you can open it up for oil and gas development, other kinds of resource extraction, mineral, et cetera. And I think there's a lot of science that will show the benefits of these lands being, both accessible to people, but also the large habitat and landscape benefits and ecosystem benefits. And so that conversation will continue. But I think we've seen a lot of value in the federal lands and the way that system has worked. And so I'll just say that that's kind of an ongoing conversation, but it ties into what you were asking about. Where do we see a lot of these conversations on specific science topics? I was going to say the habitat conversation is a really big one. And I think thinking about the larger scientific benefits of habitat beyond single species conservation, but thinking broadly about ecosystem and biodiversity conservation, how things are connected, those benefits beyond, how that impacts humans and health in terms of water systems, et cetera. There's all kinds of energy development. There's consideration that states are looking at as we look at building out transmission infrastructure and transmission lines, as they're thinking about renewable energy siting for solar and wind. There's these conversations about what are those impacts, how can those be mitigated? There's some really exciting opportunities around things like wind turbines and research always happening around bird and reducing fatalities there. And so I think that just making sure that there's really great ways to have the science keeping pace with some of these technological developments that are working towards, in many cases, state mandated clean energy goals. And that way you're going through this process in a way that creates hopefully a more sustainable energy system while also creating it in a way that's going to kind of consider and hopefully protect a lot of the ecosystem services that are already out there and benefiting. And part of that is quantifying and making sure that there is a scientific lens that's brought to those discussions. And then the final piece I would just say is all of this takes money. And that's where I know one of the challenges is. Working directly with tribes, I think, is something that there's a lot of room for states to do more of, and partnering with tribes. And we're seeing some really exciting examples of how Michigan just created a tribal legislative liaison office to help with consultation and engagement. New Mexico and recently had a bill that helps prioritize land water conservation fund dollars going to the states to make tribes eligible. They're ineligible federally. And so trying to make sure some of these state priorities do include tribes directly and make sure there's funding resources to help support those conservation efforts that tribes have really been leading on.
Let me follow up with your comments on the importance of figuring out how to do things like siting of renewable energy in a way that's consistent with environmental values. I think in the context of seeing increased pressure, not only for oil and gas development, but increased pressure to develop critical minerals for the energy transition, we're seeing a lot more demands on lands that do have important conservation value. And are you seeing useful threads develop about how to have the conversation about finding appropriate places to site renewable energy, critical minerals in ways that are most productive of ecosystem services and conservation values? Or is that really a conversation that's going to continue to be site by site specific?
It's a great question. I think a lot of it really is site specific, and I'd love to hear from Suzanne next, because I know University of Hawaii has been helping with some of these conversations just in general, both in Hawaii and some of the networks you have nationally. There are a lot of trade-offs associated in regardless of the projects like you're mentioning. And I think states in each case are taking opportunities to look at how can you assess those trade-offs, really thinking about alternatives for locations. This is with as we move into this transmission space. And in some cases we do, as I mentioned, there's mandated targets either for conservation or for clean energy. And so I think the most successful efforts have really started with those core values first, of saying what we're trying to do is either meeting our climate goals, looking at the Paris Agreement or any of those, and saying this is kind of our large goal. This is what we need to do to meet those goals. These are the kind of energy mixes that we're looking for. How can we find the best places to locate that, looking at those opportunities? And then that's where these conversations with different stakeholders, localities, at the city levels and municipalities, or with tribes, there's some really big partnership opportunities there. And that's opening up some really exciting things like agrovoltaics. I was able to tour a facility in Hawaii last year that they're now growing a bunch of lettuce below their agrovoltaic site that's going to be able to feed the Oahu school system, and with locally grown lettuce. And so how can you, when you are taking land for renewable energy development, how can you then try and use really innovative practices to maximize that land and find opportunities that it either still has really strong conservation benefits, or you're able to provide agriculture or other types of tie-ins? That's not always possible, but I think it's interesting that we're seeing some of these pilot projects spring up. And I think once again, you get 50 states trying 50 different things, and you keep learning from each other, and we can have rapid positive change.
Terrific. Suzanne, do you want to?
Yeah, I'll add to that. One thing it makes me think of is the importance of social science in this, because really what you're trying to do is understand an issue and potential solutions from all angles, so that you know in advance what the trade-offs are. And because you're going to hear from constituents that are affected by one of those trade-offs. And so you want to know the economics. You want to have really good mapping capabilities. You want to know the habitat values of a place. You want to know endangered species. You want to know impacts to agriculture. You want to know how the grid integrates in a renewable energy project. You want to, so many things are so interrelated. Even switching your lighting in a city, in a county to renewable lighting, LEDs, has been creating problems with too much bright white that has an impact on everyone, wildlife and people. And so you want to know what the solutions are there in terms of warmer lighting capabilities. So all of those things mean that when you have a challenge that you're trying to address, you want to know as much as you can from all different angles, so that you can craft the best solution, even understanding that ultimately you'll have to have trade-offs.
Perfect. Any thoughts on this particular issue, Luke or Jason, before I turn to questions from the audience? Luke.
Yeah, I wanted to follow up on, Dylan's comment about agrovoltaics and that kind of dual purpose siting of these projects in the future. We had a lot of siting concerns about offshore wind in Oregon, I think I'm a little sad that the proposals were kind of at a dead end now for offshore wind in Oregon for the time being, because while we certainly as a coastal caucus had issues with loss of potential fishing grounds for a commercial fishing fleet, and with loss of tribal waters. I think the conversation was really valuable. How can we navigate this kind of dual purpose of siting of energy, but also kind of preserving those important industries and important goals we have. Marine Reserves program in Oregon is a really good example, where we have these 5 marine reserves dedicated for conservation that we keep our fishing fleet out of, but we do provide vessel contracts to certain fisher people to go out. They can take a catch, but they're also provided with tools to do some research and monitoring to help feedback into the state to learn more about ocean changes and acidification, hypoxia, fish behavior, and all that good stuff. So I think that dual purpose discussion, this doesn't have to be a zero-sum game, and I think that we definitely need to keep that in mind.
I don't have a whole lot to add, except for to say that one of the common threads that I feel like is coming up is just these larger comprehensive conversations. It not being a zero-sum game, but that there is opportunities in all these different spaces to find ways to make it work. And I think the more that we're able to bring people to the table, as far as having scientists engaged, having community members engaged, having tribal members engaged, having state government and legislators engaged, having everyone being able to kind of have those conversations and talk through all of those different needs is so important to being able to identify where those best options are. Since, as Suzanne said, there's going to be trade-offs, but how do we make sure that we're doing it in a way that's really comprehensive of the larger picture?
Terrific. Thank you so much. Let me turn now to questions, and we have a question that builds directly, Jason, on your last comment. And the question is, in addition to being partners, how do you work with tribes, tribal scientists, and others to elevate indigenous ecological knowledge as a valid perspective and resource when it comes to science and policy making? Jason, you might want to start with this one.
Absolutely, I'm happy to. I can say one of the things that is really important to us is, we do bring, when we're having these conversations and we are bringing together different scientific expertises, recognizing that as a scientific expertise. And I think that it's something that we're getting better about, that the state is working on, that everyone is seeing how much expertise there is, how much knowledge there is, how the breadth of it, and how important it is to have that be part of those conversations at all levels. And so that's something for us. I know Dylan and Luke also mentioned capacity, and so supporting that, making sure that we aren't just asking over and over again, just being extractive, but respecting it as the scientific expertise that it is, and then finding those ways to support it have those opportunities.
Luke or Suzanne, do you want to weigh in on this, how to engage Indigenous knowledge?
I'd be happy to. Yeah. So in Oregon, we do have a legislative commission on Indian services, and they have been pretty effective in getting us connected with tribes. In our district, we do have the Confederated Tribes of Siletz Indians, and so we have a very close relationship with their board and their chair. And but I think we have a big issue in state legislatures across the nation, and in our federal government with tribal consultation, with respecting that sovereignty and understanding how to engage. And I think it's still an evolving and learning process. I mean, in my time with the legislature here, there have been numerous instances that I can recall where we have failed to effectively communicate and effectively engage tribes in our decision making. And I'm actually really excited. I know this legislative session we just began a couple weeks ago. I think this is going to be a much bigger conversation. I know several offices are putting forth legislative concepts to help build out robust training and engagement opportunities to involve the tribes and make sure that this is a daily part of our discussions, because we can't move forward without tribal consultation and engagement.
Yeah, I'll just add there is a tremendous amount of Native Hawaiian cultural knowledge that has developed over the centuries. That Jason's right. It's viewing it as science, as just a different way of conducting the science, but it's observational. It's deep knowledge of patterns and what you can see over time and pass down through history, and all of that is very hugely valuable. And it's so I think we don't even want to. We have conversations going on about how you talk about Western versus Indigenous knowledge. It's much more unified. It's just different points of view, different sort of disciplines. And it's really important to include all of them, because then you're going to come up with the best information, again, to bring to a policy matter.
Yeah, and I totally agree. One of the framings I love the most is that traditional and Indigenous scholarship should be thought of as standing shoulder by shoulder, not in confrontation with each other. Dylan, let me turn to a question for you. This is from Sadie Novak, a science fellow from Eagleton Institute of Politics at Rutgers University, working in the New Jersey Senate Majority Office as a legislative fellow. My question is, what advice, if any, do you have for states and legislators in finding balance between proactive, reactive state legislation actions in the current era regarding environment, energy, health, technology, et cetera?
Yeah, this is a big question right now, and we're seeing a lot of states really getting eager to step up their leadership. And so I think if nothing else, that we're actually going to see a lot more state leadership and proactive actions in the next couple of years. And there's a lot of opportunities for states to look at where they can go beyond federal restrictions or guidelines in different cases. So that might be adopting federal guidelines as a floor instead of a ceiling. Figuring out where there might be gaps or rollbacks and where you can proactively look at filling those, whether it's thinking about PFAS regulations or habitat conservation, water quality. So I think we're going to see that in many ways. And one of the big pieces is going to be around funding. So the Inflation Reduction Act, the IRA, had quite a bit of money down to states. And as that money is going to be no longer coming forward, and there's committed contracts that will hopefully continue to grow. But those, as we see that money not be in the future kind of checkbooks, thinking about how states continue to fund different types of environmental protection services is something that a lot of states are really wrestling with right now. And we're seeing some innovative solutions come up. But I think there is this real need and leadership opportunity for states across the country to start thinking creatively, thinking about long-term durable policies that go beyond just one state legislature, one governor, one president, one Congress, and saying we are trying to put in these systems in place that will be effective for a long time. And that's where that cross-state learning comes into effect. I would welcome, Sadie, for you to reach out to us directly, especially if there's ways we can help share examples for New Jersey. It goes to anyone listening here. Because I think this sharing is going to be more important than ever. And networks are how we get that done. And I think CCST have working and being able to collaborate with some of the other programs across the country. University of Hawaii, I know you not only have your own research, but you also are part of these research networks and leading institutions across the world, really. And I know we've talked to you about that. They've helped connect us with folks even in landlocked states. So it's not just marine, not just coastal. And Oregon has been a leader on a lot of these conversations too. So hopefully we can get these conversations sharing. And sometimes it starts with just two people talking and saying, oh, I didn't know you addressed it like that. I wonder if we could do something similar in our state. And hopefully that leads to some better programs all around.
Let me ask one final question, then we'll have time for a quick closing thought from each of you. Good to hear that there's a fellowship program in Missouri. Do you have advice or insight for building coalitions and connections in Midwest and Great Plains states, specifically at the intersection of confined animal ag and water air quality, bridging farmers, public health, and natural resources? Or how can we tell stories of impact in one state that will move people in other states? Also, where we may need to not call ourselves an environmental coalition. Dylan, I think that's kind of your area.
I think, well, just to kind of lean into the panelists we have here, we're a nonpartisan organization as well. And I think this is where place-based opportunities tend to really thrive. And I think the Coastal Caucus is a good example where there's the piece that is central to that, bringing people together, is the Coastal Association. And we see, Great Lakes folks connected that way. There's a Trails Caucus in several states. So finding kind of that locality piece that can really be powerful for everyone to say, this is a common theme or something that we all common care about. How do we then create policies that protect that area? And I think that really starts from a place of strength. And it helps maybe depoliticize it to start. And I think climate, environment, these topics come up no matter what you're talking about, whether you're thinking about growing seasons coming earlier in the Midwest, impacts on water quality, et cetera. But if you start from this shared love of a central place, it can then help you address those in a sense of, we want to make sure we're doing this in a way that protects farmers and everyone else in our community as we face these impacts that we are seeing on a year-to-year basis.
Thank you so much. 30-second closing comment from each of you. Suzanne?
Well, we're all very, very tied to our places. And so we're all looking for the same kinds of solutions. And I think we want to learn from everyone as much as we want to share. So I think that's the networking opportunity here. And I just want to invite everyone to work through National Caucus for Environmental Legislators to build those networks.
Thank you so much. Luke?
Yeah, I think closing thoughts. I mean, these academic public partnerships are absolutely vital especially for small states like Oregon. And, I think we need to start evaluating how we fund these programs with the uncertainty we're seeing. They're vital, they're necessary, they can't go away. And we just need to figure out how to sustain them. Mm-hmm.
Jason?
I would say the things that we're facing, the things that we're seeing and have been seeing for years now are things that do take all of us coming together to work on it. And so both to what Suzanne and Linda said, coming into it with that open mind to learn, to work together and to find those solutions together is going to be such an important part of how we do this moving forward.
And it's so impressive to hear from each of you. Dylan, a thought to roll us out?
I think just that these are three incredible examples of where states are leading on this. And right now there's a shared agreement that we need to have more science and more state-based leadership. And there's many, many ways to do this, but I'm really inspired when I hear from these leaders of how they're doing it. And I think it goes beyond just the legislature, but thinking about in our communities, our cities, boards and commissions, there's a real opportunity at the state and local level for us to make sure our science is in the halls of legislatures, in the halls of power, and we make the best decisions possible.
Well, I'm inspired by each of you as well. Thank you for a wonderful discussion. Suzanne Case, Luke Harkins, Jason John, and Dylan McDowell. Thanks to everybody in the audience for wonderful questions. And thanks to the superb Woods Institute staff, especially Lee Rosenbaum, Kamaya Daniels, Molly Fields, Celia Price, and Christine Black. And thanks to Evan Schwartz for Zoom support. So long, everyone.